June 18, 1944. Camp, Hearne, Texas. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. Not the sharp heat of artillery or burning fuel. This was heavier, slower, a sun that did not rage but endured. It flattened shadows. It drained sound. Even the barbed wire seemed to sag under it, its metal coils dull and tired, as if they too had been standing here for too long. I was seated at a rough wooden table just inside the fence line assigned to clerical work the Americans insisted on calling administrative assistants. Paper inventory. Translation. Lists of names that went nowhere. I wore the same faded brown uniform I had worn since crossing the Atlantic. The cloth stiff with sweat and dust. My collar darkened permanently by Texas summers. Beyond the wire, cicadas rattled in the scrub trees. Somewhere behind the barracks, a field radio crackled to life and a trumpet cut through the air, Glenn Miller faint but unmistakable. The tune drifted across the camp as if it had lost its way, looping lazily above guard towers and gravel paths, settling briefly on us before moving on. That was when the shadow fell across the table. I looked up and saw an American soldier standing on the other side of the wire. Young, barely more than a boy by European standards. His sleeves were rolled up forearms, tanned unevenly freckles standing out against dust. His helmet was pushed back, chin strap loose. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand, a pencil in the other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The war had trained us both well in silence. Then he slid the paper through the narrow gap beneath the wire, careful not to tear it. "They tell me you were a lawyer," he said. His accent was soft, Midwestern perhaps, with a trace of something rural. "I'm shipping out tomorrow." The words landed without drama. No tension in his voice, no ceremony, just a fact, like the weather. I did not answer at first. My eyes rested on the folded paper, its edges already smudged with graphite. I had written many documents in my life, contracts, petitions, wills, drafted in quiet offices for men who worried about property lines and inheritance taxes. I had never written one across a barbed wire fence in the custody of the enemy for a man preparing to walk back into a war I was no longer allowed to fight. "You don't have to," he added after a second. "They said I could ask. They said I could ask." In the Germany I had left behind, no one asked. Orders were given. Obedience followed. Trust was not extended. It was enforced. And here was this American standing in the open sun asking a prisoner to help him arrange his final words. I became aware suddenly of the smell of coffee drifting from the mess hall behind him. Real coffee, not the bitter substitute we had lived on at the front. It mixed with the scent of hot dust and creosote from the fence posts, the ordinary smells of a place not designed for dying. "You understand," he said almost apologetically. "I'm not good with this kind of thing." I nodded, though my thoughts were already racing ahead of my face. A lawyer. That word followed me like a ghost in this camp. Before the uniform, before the oath, before the war pressed itself into every corner of life, I had been a civilian attorney in Frankfurt. Property law, family disputes, boring work, my father used to say, safe work, work that assumed the world would continue to operate according to rules. Now the world was burning, and that same profession had become the reason an American soldier stood before me with his future folded into quarters. I unfolded the paper slowly. It was blank. The pencil hovered in my fingers, its wood warm from the sun. I noticed my hand was steady. That surprised me. "What's your name?" I asked, my English careful but clear. "Tom," he said. "Thomas Miller." Then, after a pause, "My mother calls me Tommy. You don't have to write that part." I almost smiled, most. Beyond him, guards moved along the perimeter with the relaxed gait of men who had learned that nothing here was going to explode. One leaned against a tower railing, chewing gum, scanning the horizon more out of habit than fear. The camp breathed in a slow rhythm. Boots on gravel, a door slamming, laughter somewhere near the laundry line. This was not how captivity had been described to us. I wrote his name at the top of the page. "Thomas Miller, Do you have children? I asked. No, sir. Wife number parents, yes. Just my mother. The pencil scratched softly. Each word felt heavier than the last. I became acutely aware of the absurdity of my position in a German prisoner of war cataloging the last wishes of an American infantryman, while my own country collapsed under bombs and retreat. Put this in, he said, tapping the paper lightly through the wire. Tell her I wasn't scared. I hesitated. He noticed. Tell her I did my job. The radio behind us shifted songs. The trumpet faded into strings. Something slow, something that sounded like home, even to ears that did not belong here. As I wrote, I wondered who would read these words. A woman somewhere in Ohio or Iowa, perhaps standing in a kitchen that smelled of bread and soap, holding a letter that had passed through too many hands. Would she notice the handwriting was not her son's? Would that matter? The fence creaked as a breeze finally stirred the air. Heat lifted just slightly enough to remind us that time was moving forward whether we wished it or not. When I reached the end of the page, there was nothing left to add. No property to distribute, no medals to mention. Just a life condensed into careful sentences written by the man he had been trained to hate. I slid the paper back toward him. He read it slowly. Once, then again. That's good, he said finally. He folded it with more care than before, as if precision might protect it. Then he did something I did not expect at all. He reached through the wire and extended his hand. Thank you, he said. Not sir, not prisoner. Just thank you. For a fraction of a second I did not move. Somewhere in my mind a warning sounded rules, consequences, the invisible lines that kept men alive in wartime. Then my hand lifted on its own. Our fingers met through the fence, awkwardly steel barbs between us. His grip was firm, warm, the grip of a man who believed tomorrow was still something you could plan for. As he stepped back, he gave a small nod, the kind men give each other without thinking, and walked toward the barracks without looking over his shoulder. I remained seated, pencil still in my hand, staring at the empty space where he had stood. The radio kept playing. The guards kept walking. The sun kept pressing down. And for the first time since the war began, a question formed in my mind that I could not answer. Why would a man trust the enemy with his final words? I did not sleep that night. The camp quieted the way it always did after lights out, gradually, unevenly. Boots faded into gravel. Voices lowered, then disappeared. Somewhere, a door banged once hard enough to echo, and then even that was gone. What remained was the Texas night insects clicking in endless rhythm. Warm air trapped between wooden walls, the smell of sweat that never quite left the barracks. I lay on my cot, staring at the underside of the bunk above me, replaying the moment again and again. The folded paper, the pencil, the hand through the wire. Trust. In the darkness, the word felt dangerous. By morning, the fear had taken shape. Not a single sharp fear, but many small ones layered and persistent like heat rash under the skin. Had anyone seen us? A guard lingering too long. A prisoner watching from the corner of his eye. A report filed somewhere with my name on it, written in a language I could not read but understood well enough. I had been useful to the Americans before translations, inventories, orderly work, but usefulness was a thin shield. It could be withdrawn without warning. The Geneva Convention existed on paper. We all knew that. We had been told about it during intake, told we were protected, told rules applied here. But I had lived long enough to know that rules bent easily when suspicion entered the room, and suspicion always followed trust. At breakfast, I felt it immediately. A pause in conversation when I sat down. A look held half a second too long. Men I had shared bunks with now measured the space between us as if recalculating distance. One of them leaned close as we stood in line for coffee. "I heard you were talking to a guard yesterday," he said quietly. His German clipped careful. "Administrative work," I answered. The truth trimmed down to safety. He nodded, but his eyes did not soften. In another life, we might have discussed legal theory or argued about football clubs. Here, the question beneath his words was simpler. Whose side are you on? In Germany, that question had teeth. Before the war, trust had been a professional necessity. Clients trusted me with their finances, their marriages, their failures. But once the uniform replaced the suit, trust became something else entirely. A misjudged conversation, a careless word, a neighbor who listened too closely. Men disappeared for less. The Reich had taught us that survival required vigilance, not faith. Loyalty was performed, not felt. And the worst crime of all was to be seen as useful to the wrong people. Here in America, none of that seemed to apply, and that frightened me more than if it had. Because in this place, trust appeared without warning, without price. It was offered casually, like coffee or cigarettes, no shouting, no threats, no immediate consequences. That absence unsettled me. I did not know how to defend myself against kindness that did not announce itself as a trap. During roll call, I kept my eyes forward. Numbers were read, names checked, the routine held. Still, my heart beat faster than necessary, as if my body expected something my mind could not predict. Across the ocean, the war was reaching its breaking point. We knew that much even if we were not allowed to say it aloud. Rumors moved faster than official news. Normandy. Landings. Entire divisions swallowed by fire and steel. Men whispered at night, piecing together scraps from newspapers used to wrap supplies, from overheard radio broadcasts, from the expressions on the faces of American guards who no longer bothered to hide their confidence. Germany was bleeding. But a prisoner was not permitted to believe that fully. Hope was dangerous too. To accept defeat meant admitting the world you had sacrificed everything for was already gone. In America, the scale of the war felt different. We saw it in passing, never directly. Trains rolling past the camp, endless lines of freight cars. Trucks loaded with equipment that looked new, untouched by desperation. Guards spoke of brothers overseas, of cousins in the Navy, of neighbors working double shifts in factories back home. 12 million Americans in uniform, they said. 12 million. The number was incomprehensible. And those men boys really were expected to think about death. To write wills. To leave instructions for kitchens and farms and mothers who would keep living after them. That part at least made sense to me. I had written wills before. I understood what it meant to plan for absence. What I did not understand was why I had been invited into that space. As the day wore on, my fear sharpened into something more precise. I began to imagine the consequences not of what I had done, but of what it might mean. What if the soldier did not return? What if his letter arrived stained or folded too many times and someone noticed the handwriting? What if my name was remembered not as a footnote, but as an anomaly? The Americans believed paperwork preserved order. The Germans believed paperwork exposed guilt. I had lived under both systems long enough to know that documents outlived intentions. By afternoon, the sun pressed down harder than before. Work details moved slowly. Dust clung to skin. Tempers shortened. A man 2 rows down from me muttered something under his breath about collaborators. No name, but names were rarely needed. I said nothing. Silence had kept me alive before. That evening, as I sat on my bunk, I thought about the soldier again. Thomas Miller. The careful way he had folded the paper. The way he had hesitated before saying his mother's name as if invoking her might make the war too real. In another country, another time we might have met across a desk. I would have charged him a fee and argued about clauses. Here we had met across a fence, and the only currency exchanged was trust. Trust, I knew, was not neutral. It changed the shape of things. In the system I had come from, trust flowed downward, enforced by fear. In this place it seemed to move sideways, offered between strangers without instruction. That inversion disoriented me. It made me question my instincts, my training, the careful armor I had built around myself. Because if trust did not come with punishment, then what did it demand in return? As night fell again, I found myself listening not for threats but for footsteps. A guard coming to call my name. An order delivered in clipped English. None came. The camp settled into its usual rhythm, indifferent to my thoughts. Radios played softly in the distance. Somewhere laughter rose and fell unguarded. I realized then that my fear was not rooted only in what might happen to me. It was rooted in what had already happened. A line had been crossed not by violence, but by invitation. I had been allowed briefly into the private fear of an American preparing to die. That access could not be undone. It had changed the way I saw the fence, the guards, even myself. In Germany, trust had been a liability. Here, it seemed to be a habit. And that was the most dangerous thing of all because habits spread. As I lay back and closed my eyes, one thought returned again and again, heavier than the heat, heavier than the war itself. If trust could exist between enemies without force, then everything I had been taught about power was wrong, and I did not yet know what that realization would cost me. The second time he came, there was no announcement, no escort, no raised voices, no sense that anything unusual was about to happen. I was assigned to the same table near the fence, sorting forms whose purpose I no longer tried to understand when I noticed the shadow fall again less sharply this time, as if it belonged there. Thomas Miller stood on the other side of the wire, the same rolled sleeves, the same loose helmet strap. Only now he carried two things instead of one, a folded paper tucked into his breast pocket and a dented metal mug in his hand. He held the mug up slightly. "Coffee," he said. "It's still hot." A guard, farther down the line, glanced over, saw nothing worth correcting, and turned back to his cigarette. No one moved to intervene. No one took notes. Thomas set the mug down on the wooden surface between us, careful not to spill. The smell rose immediately, dark, bitter, unmistakably real. Not the substitute powder we drank. The kind that lingered in kitchens and morning routines. I figured, he said, nodding toward the table. "This is better than yesterday. Less sun in your eyes." That was the extent of the preparation. No interrogation room, no uniformed observer hovering behind him. Just a rough table scarred by years of use, a pencil worn down almost to its metal collar, and a cup of coffee placed within reach of a prisoner. I waited for the moment when someone would tell us to stop. It never came. He slid the paper toward me again. This time it was not blank. He had written a few lines himself, uneven handwriting, hesitant but deliberate. I read them quietly, then looked up. "You want this reorganized," I said. "Legally." "Yes, sir." He hesitated, then corrected himself. Yes, if that's okay." I nodded and turned the paper sideways as if we were colleagues sharing a desk. The fence remained between us, but it had lost some of its authority. As I began to rewrite his words, shaping them into something that would hold under scrutiny, he watched my hand closely, not with suspicion, but with relief. "I just want my mother to understand what I wanted," he said after a moment. Not what he did, not how he died, what he wanted. That distinction mattered. He told me about her then. Not her name, he kept that private, but small things. How she folded towels too precisely. How she listened to the radio every evening and hummed along without realizing it. How she would read the letter more than once looking for something she had missed. "I don't want her thinking I was angry," he said. "Or scared. I was scared, but that's not the point." I wrote as he spoke, careful to preserve his meaning without borrowing his voice. A will was not a confession. It was an act of order against chaos. The pencil moved steadily. I became aware with some surprise that my hands no longer shook. Around us the camp went on with its business. A truck backfired near the motor pool. Somewhere a man laughed sharp and brief. A radio crackled and caught again on music, the notes drifting across the open space without direction. No one was performing for us. No one was watching. This kindness had no audience. That was what unsettled me most. In the Germany I had known, gestures were calculated. Mercy was displayed when it served a purpose, when it could be photographed or reported or twisted into proof of moral superiority. Here there was no speech, no explanation, no attempt to extract gratitude. The Americans did not tell us they were humane. They simply behaved that way and seemed surprised when we noticed. When I paused to clarify a clause, Thomas leaned in, slightly resting his forearms on the wire. "You ever do this before?" he asked. "Many times," I said, "before the war." He nodded, satisfied. "Guess you never thought you'd be doing it here." "No," I admitted. "I did not." He smiled faintly at that, not amused, just acknowledging the absurdity. Two men from opposite sides of the world meeting in Texas to prepare for a death neither of us could control. As I wrote, I thought about the rules that allowed this to happen. The Geneva Convention explained to us during intake by an officer who spoke German carefully, as if precision itself were a form of respect. They told us we were protected. They told us the Americans followed these rules not because they were required to, but because they believed in them. At the time, I had assumed it was propaganda of a different sort. Now, watching a guard stroll past without even glancing at us, I began to understand something else. This was not restraint born of weakness. This was confidence. A nation that could afford to treat its prisoners as men. A system that did not fear what might happen if cruelty was withheld. The Americans were fighting a war on two fronts, feeding allies and enemies alike, producing weapons faster than we could destroy them, and in the midst of that they allowed a captured lawyer to help a soldier write his will. No chains. Just a table and a pencil. When I finished, I read the document aloud, slowly, letting each sentence settle. Thomas listened without interruption. When I reached the end, he exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for days. "That sounds like me," he said quietly. I slid the paper back. He folded it with care, tucking it into his pocket as if it might dissolve if mishandled. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached for the coffee mug and pushed it toward me. "You should have some," he said. "I've had enough." I hesitated. Accepting food or drink from a guard was not forbidden, but it was noticed. Lines were supposed to remain intact. He must have sensed my pause. "It's just coffee," he said, "and I'm leaving tomorrow anyway." I lifted the mug. The metal was warm against my palms. I took a careful sip. It tasted like mornings I had forgotten, like kitchens that were not blacked out, like a world where paper mattered more than uniforms. As I set the mug down, I felt something shift inside me, not gratitude exactly, but a loosening, a crack in a structure I had assumed was permanent. This, I thought, though I did not say it aloud, is not what I was taught. I had been taught that power demanded fear, that order required punishment, that enemies could only be controlled through force. Yet here was power that needed no spectacle. Order that relied on routine decency. An enemy who trusted a prisoner not because he had to, but because he could. Thomas stepped back then, adjusting his helmet. "I should get going," he said. "Train leaves early." I nodded. He paused as if considering something, then gave a small, awkward salute, not formal, not mocking. "Just habit." "Thank you," he said again. As he walked away, I watched until he disappeared among the barracks. I did not know if I would ever see him again. I did not know if the letter would reach its destination, but I knew this something fundamental had changed. Not in the camp, not in the war, in me. For the first time, the idea took root that strength and mercy were not opposites. That a country could be powerful enough to win and still choose not to be cruel, and that realization once formed could not be unlearned. The last revision took only a few minutes. There was nothing left to refine, no clauses to tighten, no language to soften. The will was as complete as such a thing could be, under a Texas sun, written by one man for another in a place neither had chosen. Thomas read it slowly, not scanning, not searching for mistakes, reading the way someone reads a letter they expect to carry weight long after they are gone. His lips moved silently on certain lines, At one point he stopped, went back a sentence, and read it again. I watched his face as if it were evidence. When he finished, he folded the paper, carefully smoothing the crease with his thumb. He nodded once. "That's it?" he said. "That's exactly it." The words did not feel like approval. They felt like relief. For a moment, we simply stood there, the fence between us no longer the most important thing in the space. The afternoon had softened. The heat was still present, but less oppressive now, as if even the air had decided to give us a pause. Thomas slipped the folded document into the inside pocket of his jacket. He tapped it once absent-mindedly, the way men do when they want to reassure themselves something is still where it belongs. Then he did something that broke the remaining structure I had been leaning on. He reached through the wire again, not tentatively, not cautiously. He extended his hand, fully fingers open palm, steady, I did not think. I did not calculate risk or consequence. My body moved before my training could intervene. I stepped closer to the fence and took his hand. The grip was firm, not aggressive, not ceremonial. A working man's handshake practiced and unremarkable in another context, but here it carried the weight of years. The wire pressed into the back of my knuckles. His skin was rougher than mine, calloused in places I recognized from my own childhood before the law had replaced labor. His hand was warm, solid, alive, and then my hands began to shake. Not violently, not visibly to anyone else, I think, just enough for me to feel it, a tremor that traveled from my fingers up my wrists and into my chest. I was not afraid. That realization came as a shock of its own. Fear had a familiar shape to me. Fear tightened, the throat narrowed, the eyes prepared the body for impact. This was something else entirely. This was collapse, not outward, but inward, a quiet failure of the walls I had spent years reinforcing. I tightened my grip instinctively as if to anchor myself. Thomas noticed. His thumb pressed briefly against the back of my hand, a small, unconscious adjustment meant to steady, not to restrain. He said nothing. He did not ask if I was all right. He trusted me to stand. That was when it broke. Not all at once, not with tears or noise. The collapse came the way rot does unnoticed until the structure gives way under its own weight. A series of realizations arrived without order, without permission. I had spent years believing that systems fell only under force, that laws were erased by bombs, by defeat, by the replacement of one uniform with another. I had watched my profession hollowed out, turned into an instrument of obedience rather than justice. Statutes rewritten to serve ideology. Courts transformed into theaters. We told ourselves it was temporary, necessary, that the ends justified the erosion of principle. Standing there hand in hand with an American soldier preparing to die, I understood how wrong that had been. What destroyed the system I came from was not the enemy's firepower, it was the willingness to abandon restraint. In Germany, law had been made complex, ceremonial, impenetrable. It had grown dense with a language meant to obscure responsibility. Judges no longer asked what was right, only what was permitted. Lawyers no longer protected individuals, they protected outcomes. Here, the law had been reduced to its simplest function. This man wanted his mother to understand him. That was all. No ideology, no pageantry, no demand for loyalty, just clarity. The Americans did not need to dramatize their morality. They practiced it quietly in routines that did not ask to be admired. The Geneva Convention was not a slogan here. It was a habit, a baseline expectation, a way of doing things that assumed dignity would be extended until there was a reason not to. And that assumption, so foreign to me, had undone years of conditioning in a single afternoon. My hands steadied slowly. The shaking passed, leaving behind a hollowness that felt both frightening and clean. Thomas released his grip first, not abruptly, just naturally, the way a man does when the moment has ended. "Take care," he said. I nodded. Words felt unnecessary, inadequate. He stepped back, adjusting his jacket, and for a second he looked like any other young man about to board a train. No heroics, no visible weight of what lay ahead. Before he turned away, he paused. "You know," he said, "my mom always said a handshake tells you more than a speech." I smiled, then, not wide, not forced. A small smile meant for no one else. I think she was right. Then he turned and walked toward the barracks. I remained by the fence long after he was gone. Around me, the camp resumed its rhythm. Orders called out. Footsteps passed. Somewhere, a door slammed too hard, followed by a curse and laughter. Life continuing indifferent to the moment that had just occurred. I looked down at my hands. They no longer shook. What frightened me now was not what might happen if someone reported the exchange. It was what had already happened inside me. For years, hatred had been easy. It had been supplied, reinforced, justified. It required no effort of imagination. The enemy was faceless, cruel, by definition, undeserving of trust. But trust, once experienced, did not retreat quietly. It lingered. It asked questions. It exposed the fragility of beliefs I had once thought unassailable. I returned to my bunk that evening and sat in the fading light, listening to the sounds of the camp settle around me. I thought of the courts I had once believed in, the language I had once trusted to protect people, the compromises that had seemed small at the time. None of those things had collapsed under attack. They had collapsed under compliance. Here, in a place built to hold enemies, I had witnessed the opposite. A system strong enough to allow humanity without fear of losing control. I lay back and closed my eyes, the memory of the handshake still present in my palm. Hatred had taken years to build. It had taken only one moment of unguarded trust to make it impossible to maintain. And I knew, with a certainty, that frightened me more than any punishment could, that I would never see power or justice the same way again. The morning Thomas left the camp woke earlier than usual. Trucks idled near the gate, their engines coughing awake in the cool hour before the sun reclaimed the ground. Men moved with purpose, duffel bags slung over shoulders, rifles checked and rechecked. Orders passed quickly, efficiently, without raised voices. This was not chaos. It was transition. I watched from the edge of the compound as the column formed. Thomas stood among them, indistinguishable now, except to me. Same helmet, same boots, dusted the same pale brown as every other pair. The uniform erased what I knew of him, flattened him into the shape of a soldier moving toward the front. For a moment I wondered if he would look back. He did not. The truck tailgates dropped. Men climbed aboard, helping each other without comment. When the last one was seated, an officer gave a brief signal. No speech, no ceremony. The convoy rolled forward, tires crunching over gravel, passing beneath the gate and out into the Texas morning. Just like that, he was gone. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the empty road as if it might reverse itself. Around me, life resumed its steady pace. Work details were called. Guards returned to their posts. Someone shouted for a missing clipboard. The war, it seemed, had no interest in sentiment. Yet something in me refused to move on. I thought of his will folded carefully against his chest. I thought of the woman who would one day hold it, reading words written by a stranger in a country she had never seen. I thought of how small that moment had been in the machinery of war and how enormous it felt to the men inside it. It was then, standing there with the dust settling around my boots, that the sentence finally formed clearly in my mind. When death is close, all men become the same. Not identical, not interchangeable, but stripped of the performances we learned to survive. Titles fell away. Uniforms lost their authority. What remained was the simple, terrifying truth that life could end without warning, and that meaning had to be made before it did. The war had taught us to divide the world with precision, enemy and ally, loyal and traitor, strong and weak. We lived by those divisions because they simplified things. They allowed us to move forward without asking questions that slowed the machine. But death ignored those lines completely. Thomas had not come to me as a representative of America or an instrument of policy. He had come as a son who wanted to be understood. In that moment, the uniform mattered less than the handwriting. The cause mattered less than the mother who would read the letter. That realization did not weaken him, it clarified him. In the weeks that followed, I noticed other things I had previously dismissed. Details that, taken alone, seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The way supplies arrived with relentless regularity. Crates marked with dates and destinations unloaded efficiently, never quite running short. Food that appeared not as a luxury, but as a baseline expectation. Boots replaced before they wore through. Medical care administered without bargaining. I had grown up believing abundance bred softness. That a nation comfortable enough to feed its enemies could not possibly sustain a war of this scale. I was wrong. America's strength did not lie only in its weapons, though those were plentiful enough. It lay in something quieter and far more durable, a system that functioned without panic. Factories that ran day and night not as emergency measures but as organized extensions of civilian life. Farms that produced more than they consumed. Trains that moved with the confidence of schedules honored. This was not improvisation. It was preparation. And woven through it all was an assumption that order did not require cruelty to maintain itself. The guards here did not need to prove their authority. They did not need to humiliate us to feel secure. Their power was not brittle. It did not crack under scrutiny. I had been taught that morality was a luxury reserved for peacetime, that war demanded exceptions, that survival justified erosion. What I was witnessing suggested the opposite. Morality practiced consistently created stability. It reduced resistance. It allowed men to operate without constantly anticipating betrayal. It conserved energy for the work that mattered. This was not idealism. It was strategy. The Americans called it adherence to convention, rules agreed upon before emotions took over. Principles enforced even when no one was watching. They trusted that such restraint would pay dividends in ways not immediately visible. Standing in that camp, watching a convoy disappear toward the horizon, I understood how those dividends accumulated. Men surrendered more readily when they believed surrender did not mean annihilation. Camps ran more smoothly when prisoners were treated as human beings rather than animals. Guards slept better when they did not have to enforce brutality. Even now, years later, the memory of that handshake remains sharper than any explosion I witnessed during the war, because it revealed something that ideology never could, that a nation could wage total war without abandoning itself. Thomas did not return to the camp. I never learned his fate. Perhaps he survived. Perhaps he did not. War offers no guarantees, only probabilities. But his absence changed nothing about what had already been set in motion. I continued my work, translations, forms, lists, yet each task carried a new weight. I was no longer merely complying. I was observing, measuring one system against another, not in theory but in practice. The contrast was unavoidable. Where I came from, obedience had been extracted. Here, cooperation was assumed. Where my former courts had cloaked decisions in language meant to obscure responsibility, American procedures favored clarity. Not because they were naive, but because clarity limited abuse. They did not pretend to be perfect. They simply refused to pretend cruelty was necessary. As summer deepened, the camp buzzed with rumors. Advances in France. Cities liberated. Names we recognized and others we did not. Each announcement brought a mix of dread and inevitability. Germany was losing. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe it fully. Not because the Americans told me so, but because everything around me made it clear. The steady confidence, the absence of desperation, the sense that this nation knew deep down that time was on its side. And that knowledge did not make them reckless. It made them patient. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the barracks, casting long shadows across the yard, I found myself thinking not about the war's end, but about what came after. What kind of world would emerge from this? What kind of men would rebuild it? I thought of Thomas's mother unfolding the letter. I thought of the millions of American families doing the same reading words written under circumstances their children could barely explain. Those letters were not propaganda. They were records of intention, and perhaps that was the difference. America did not just produce tanks and planes and ships at a scale we could not match. It produced continuity, a belief that even in war life should remain intelligible, that systems should still make sense, that human dignity was not an obstacle to victory, but part of it. That belief had not been shouted at me. It had been demonstrated, quietly, at a table, with a pencil. When the sun finally set and the camp lights flickered on, I returned to my bunk and sat for a long time without moving. The sounds of evening settled in around me. Footsteps, distant voices, the low hum of generators. I understood then that whatever happened next, whatever flag flew over my future, I had already crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. I had seen a nation at war choose restraint over revenge, clarity over spectacle, humanity over hatred. And once seen, that choice could not be unseen. When death is near, all men become the same. But it is how a nation treats men at that moment, enemy or not, that reveals who it truly is. I closed my eyes, the dust of Texas still clinging to my clothes, and knew with certainty that I was no longer the man who had arrived here. America had not defeated me. It had shown me another way to win. I left America in the spring. There was no ceremony attached to the departure, no speeches about reconciliation, no final lecture on democracy. We were processed, counted, handed documents we barely understood, and placed on a ship that pointed east. As the coastline receded, I stood at the rail longer than most. The water stretched out in every direction, calm and indifferent, carrying us back toward a continent that no longer resembled the one we had left years earlier. I carried nothing of material value with me, no souvenirs, no letters, only memory. Germany greeted us with silence and damage. Cities reduced to outlines. Streets familiar only by instinct. Buildings that had survived the bombs carried scars that made them feel temporary, as if even stone no longer trusted permanence. People moved carefully, cautiously, measuring their words the way one measures steps across broken ground. Food was scarce. Trust scarcer still. Everyone had a story they told, and another they kept to themselves. When I spoke of America, people listened politely. Some nodded, some smiled thinly. A few dismissed it outright. "You were treated well because you were useful," one man said. "That is not morality, that is convenience." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps usefulness had opened the door. But I had seen how easily that door could have been closed and how deliberately it had been left open. I did not speak often about the camp. I learned quickly that the past was a dangerous place to linger. People wanted answers, not complexity. They wanted villains they could recognize and heroes they could believe in without effort. What I carried back from America did not fit neatly into either category. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself slowly, unevenly. Laws were rewritten. Courts reopened. Language was scrubbed and redefined. We told ourselves we had learned something, that the past would not repeat itself if we kept our eyes open. And yet, even as the rubble cleared, I found my thoughts returning to a table in Texas, to a pencil worn down to its stub, to a nation at war that had chosen again and again to treat restraint not as weakness, but as strength. Over time, America changed in my imagination, not because it had changed itself, but because the image presented to the world shifted. Newspapers spoke of scandals of divisions of industries shuttered and trust eroded. Commentators argued about decline and decay. The country that had once felt impossibly unified now appeared fractured, unsure of itself, angry in the ways that felt unfamiliar. When people asked me what America had been like, I hesitated. The America I knew was not perfect. It was loud. It was confident to the point of arrogance. It assumed its way of doing things made sense because it usually did. But it was also disciplined in a way that surprised me. Focused. Purposeful. In 1944, America had been at war on a scale that consumed entire generations. 12 million men and women in uniform. Factories operating around the clock. Farms producing beyond capacity. Families rationing not because they had to, but because they believed it mattered. There had been arguments then, too. Doubts. Fears. But they were contained within a larger agreement that the work came first and the reckoning later. When I looked at America now through newspapers and broadcasts and conversations with visitors, I wondered whether that agreement still existed. The country seemed to argue with itself constantly, to question not only policies but intentions, to distrust institutions that had once been taken for granted. I did not judge this. I had seen what blind trust could produce. But I could not help comparing. In the camp, guards did not ask whether the rules were popular. They followed them because consistency mattered. They did not debate whether feeding prisoners sent the wrong message. They fed them because hunger created problems and dignity reduced them. The morality I witnessed was not emotional. It was operational. Today, morality seemed louder, more performative, less settled. Perhaps that was inevitable. Perhaps peace demanded a different kind of vigilance than war. Still, the question lingered. Would America do it the same way now? Would a nation still extend trust to an enemy without demanding proof first? Would it still believe that strength made mercy possible rather than risky? Would it still assume that rules mattered most when no one was watching? I do not know the answers. I only know what I saw. I saw a country so certain of its capacity that it did not fear kindness. So organized that it did not rely on cruelty to maintain order. So confident in its future that it could afford to care about the humanity of those it had defeated. That version of America did not announce itself. It simply functioned. As years turned into decades, I noticed something else. The people most drawn to my stories were not politicians or scholars. They were children and grandchildren of soldiers. Men and women who had grown up hearing fragments mentions of camps of ships of places their fathers or grandfathers never spoke about directly. They listened differently, not for ideology, for recognition. When I described the guards, they nodded. When I spoke of routine kindness, they smiled quietly. When I mentioned a will written by a prisoner for an American soldier, they grew still. They did not ask whether it was typical. They asked whether it was true, and that question I realized mattered more because truth carries obligation. If this is who we were, it asks, then, who are we now? Not in accusation, in curiosity. I have never returned to Texas. I have never stood again at that fence. Time has made that impossible, even if distance had not. But sometimes when I read about America struggling with itself, its industries shifting overseas, its politics hardening its people, questioning one another's motives, I think back to that summer, to a nation under immense pressure that chose steadiness over spectacle, to young men who wrote wills not because they were cynical, but because they were practical. To a system that understood something we often forget, that trust once lost costs more to rebuild than any factory. I do not claim that the past was better, only that it was clearer. Clearer about purpose, clearer about limits, clearer about what mattered when everything else was uncertain. The America I encountered in 1944 did not believe kindness would save it. It believed kindness would stabilize it. There is a difference. As the years have gone on, that distinction has become harder to see even for Americans themselves. The noise has grown louder, the confidence more fragile, and so I find myself asking the same question again and again, not as a challenge but as a quiet inheritance. If faced with the same test today, would America trust itself enough to act the same way? I do not know. But I know this. The answer matters not to history books, but to the people who will one day look back and decide what kind of country this was. and whether its strength once meant more than victory alone. I am an old man now. The war lives in me differently than it once did, not as noise or urgency, but as a series of quiet rooms I return to without warning. A fence line, a wooden table, a handshake I can still feel if I close my eyes. My children know the story in fragments. My grandchildren know it as something gentler shaped by time and retelling. They ask questions I did not know how to ask when I was their age. Not about blame, about meaning. They have found the documents, of course. Papers survive better than people do. A copy of a will kept for reasons I never fully explained. Notes written in careful English. A date. A place. Camp Hearne, Texas. Sometimes they bring it to me and place it on the table between us the way Thomas once placed his paper before me. "Why did you keep this?" they ask. I tell them the truth. Because it reminded me of who I became there. They read the words slowly, their fingers tracing sentences written by a man they never met in a country they have only visited as tourists. They notice the handwriting is not mine, but not his either. Something in between, a collaboration. They ask if I ever apologized to the Americans. I tell them no. They look surprised at that. They have grown up in a world where apologies are expected, demanded, sometimes rehearsed, where the past is something to be accounted for publicly. But that is not what this was. There was no apology offered because none was asked for. What passed between us was not forgiveness negotiated across history, but trust exchanged in a moment when neither of us knew if there would be another. Gratitude does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is simply carried. I tell my grandchildren about the soldier's mother, not her name, which I never knew, but her presence. How everything he wanted to say led back to her. How the war, with all its scale and destruction, reduced itself in that moment to a single kitchen table somewhere in America. They ask what happened to him. I tell them I do not know, and that answer, I have learned, is important. History often pretends to be complete. It likes endings, victories, dates that close chapters. But the most human parts of war do not resolve so neatly. They disperse. They live on in objects tucked into drawers and habits formed under pressure and values passed down without explanation. One of my grandchildren once asked me if the Americans were kind because they won. It took me a long time to answer. No, I said finally. They won because they could afford to be kind. That distinction matters. Kindness born of strength leaves a different mark than kindness begged for by weakness. It does not demand repayment. It does not keep score. It trusts that its example will do the work on its own. The Americans I knew did not ask me to carry their story forward. They assumed it would survive without instruction. Now, years later, it does, through people who never set foot in that camp, who never heard Glenn Miller drift across barbed wire, who never felt a handshake bridge an ocean of hatred. My family does not speak of the war with pride. We speak of it with care. We do not claim virtue by proximity. We do not pretend that one moment redeems everything that came before or after. We simply remember. And remembering, I have learned, is a responsibility. Some of the grandchildren of American soldiers have written to me over the years. They found my name through records, through archives, through chance. They ask polite questions. They thank me for helping someone they loved even if they are not sure how. I tell them they do not owe me anything. Their grandparents did the harder part. They lived their values when it was inconvenient. That is what my family remembers most, not the food, not the camp, not even the absence of cruelty, but the quiet consistency. The way decency was practiced without expectation of reward. In a world that now argues endlessly about symbols and gestures, that memory feels fragile, but it is still here. Sometimes, late in the evening, my grandchildren sit with me and ask what America was like then. Not the America of movies or headlines, but the one I encountered as an enemy. I tell them it was confident, busy, imperfect, but anchored. I tell them about young men who wrote wills because they believed responsibility did not end at the battlefield. About guards who followed rules not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted the rules themselves. I tell them about a country that understood something simple and difficult, that how you treat the defeated says more about you than how you defeat them. They listen quietly. When they leave, they sometimes take the copy of the will with them just to hold it, to feel the weight of the paper, to imagine the hands that once passed it across a fence. I let them, because the story does not belong to me alone. It belongs to the space between generations where meaning settles slowly. There are no apologies written in that document, no accusations, just intention, and that in the end is what survives. When history speaks, it often speaks loudly through dates, through battles, through names carved into stone. But families remember differently. They remember who showed restraint when it was easier not to, who trusted when suspicion would have been safer, who believed that even in war, humanity was not optional. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who trusted my grandfather with his last words.